It was unseasonably warm when Mr. Howard doffed his jacket. As an afterthought, he also removed his gun belt, saying he didn't want the neighbors seeing him armed. He could hear his wife shuffling in the kitchen as he pulled his boots off, along with the quiet laughter of his children playing in the front yard. Howard's keen eyes scanned the parlor. He soon stood with a sigh and carefully climbed atop a chair, intent on dusting a framed picture that his wife had so lovingly mounted to the wall. That's when he heard the sound. The unmistakable swish of cold steel leaving a leather holster, followed by the mechanical click of a hammer. A split second later, a bullet struck Howard in the back of his head. A brief explosion and blinding light, followed by an all-encompassing darkness. Never again would he hear his children at play. Never again would he see the desire in his wife's eyes, nor experience the simple pleasure of a fine horse underneath him. At long last, the war was over. Jesse James was dead. It had been over 3 years since Jesse and the boys rode into Northfield, a disastrous decision that saw the entire gang either dead or imprisoned, save for Jesse and his brother Frank. They alone had managed to escape, and for the next couple of years, Jesse James did his level best to keep a low profile. Moved his family to the outskirts of Nashville, where, so far as the neighbors were concerned, he was John Davis Howard, a gentleman farmer and a grain speculator with a penchant for fine horse flesh and playing faro. His brother Frank was likewise living under an alias, that of B.J. Woodson. Swore off profanity, joined the Methodist Church, and, interestingly enough, found solace in his labor. Quote, I worked regularly every day on the farm, seldom failing to put in my full 10 hours per day in the field. At the end of the year, I engaged a team for the lumber company, and I carried out my agreement to the letter, driving a 4-mule team every day, taking my meals in the woods and never doing less than a full hand's work. Now, while Frank may have been enjoying the simple pleasures of honest toil, his brother, Jesse, had a much harder time adjusting to the monotony. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Jesse, not yet 32 years old, had spent most of his adult life riding like the devil, terrorizing bluecoats, bank tellers, and Pinkertons. The rush of that wind in your face, gun in your hand lifestyle was like a drug, and Jesse craved attention, the kind he got on a national scale. Racehorses did not make the headlines. At the same time, he continued to spend money fast and easy, just like in the old days, and he accumulated creditors even faster. For Jesse, the answer was obvious, or inevitable. Even though the nightmarish memories of Northfield were still vivid, Jesse began putting together a new gang. End of quote. Now, we will get to that new gang here in just a minute, but this is also when Jesse allegedly struck up a friendship with Billy the Kid. The main source of them meeting comes from Dr. Henry Hoyt in his 1929 book, Frontier Doctor. Hoyt and Billy the Kid were friends, that much is certain. They had gotten to know each other over in Texas following the Lincoln County War. And by the summer of 1879, Hoyt was working at the Adobe Hotel, near the hot springs outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico. He was there one day in July when Billy introduced him to his dinner companion, Mr. Howard from Tennessee. Said he was there to see his old friend by the name of Scott Moore. And not only did Moore operate the Adobe Hotel, but he also supposedly hailed from Clay County, Missouri, same place where Jesse was from. Like I said, Moore did operate the hotel, but his Missouri roots have yet to be officially established. Be that as it may, Hoyt's story was backed up by future New Mexico Governor Miguel Otero, who also maintained that Billy and Jesse were seen dining together. The Las Vegas Gazette would even print an article about it a few months later. Hell, the railroads were even offering direct trips from Kansas City to Vegas. So yeah, we may not have conclusive proof, but I do think that this meeting is possible, or was possible. That said, Jesse's daughter Mary was born on July 17th, right around the same time that he would have been traveling west to the land of enchantment. I only bring this up because Jesse almost certainly attended the birth of his son a few years prior. He even skipped out on a bank robbery to ensure that he could be there. Then in February of 1879, his wife Z gave birth to twin boys, Gould and Montgomery. Sadly, the newborns would only live a few days, but legend has it that Jesse carved their gravestones with his own 2 hands. Which begs the question, would Jesse James run off to New Mexico, knowing that he'd be absent from Mary's birth, especially considering their recent losses? And unfortunately, I do not have an answer. Whatever the case, though, he was back in Missouri by September, and busy assembling that fresh gang of desperados. Now, some of these old boys Jesse was already familiar with, like his cousin Wood Height and Clell Miller's little brother Ed. The rest of the gang, a mixed bag of mostly unknowns, included an Irishman by the name of Bill Ryan, one of Ryan's buddies, Tucker Basham, and Vernon County native Dick Liddil. Dick, by the way, had just got out of prison for stealing a horse. And man, talk about an unfortunate name. Dick Liddil. It's spelled Liddil, but that sure ain't the way it sounds. I guess Jesse had a fondness for such curious handles, as he also recruited bandits Tallywhacker Tiny, Johnson Slim, Meat Stack Minnie, and the notoriously quick on the draw, Craig, I have a very small penis, Kilpatrick. And yeah, I did just make up all those names, except Dick Liddil. He was definitely real. And according to Dick, he was first introduced to Jesse by former bushwhacker Ben Morrow. Quote, "About 2 o'clock, I went to Ben's and found Jesse in the yard. We had a chat and went out to where his horse was tied in the woods. He said he was broke and wanted to make a raise and wanted me to help him. I agreed." End of quote. And the raise in question turned out to be a train at the Glendale Depot, just outside of Independence, Missouri. Now, before you get to sending emails and telling me that Glendale is over 200 miles to the east of Independence, yes, you are correct. But that's a different Glendale. Believe it or not, they would also rob a train in that Glendale in the near future. The place I'm talking about right now, though, was just a tiny little blip on the tracks. Wasn't nothing there but a store, a telegraph office, and a little whistle stop. If you're ever in Independence and find yourself standing on the corner of East 39th and Celsa, that's where the Glendale Depot was. And for a team of mostly amateurs, the robbery went off without a hitch. Nobody got hurt, and the bandits made off with a cool $6,000 in cash. But you know what they say, right? Easy come, easy go. To quote historian T.J. Stiles, Jesse didn't behave as if he were afraid of death. Like an addict unable to restrain himself, he indulged as never before in the vices of his brigand life. He gambled so frequently and so recklessly that even the quiet Z, who had stood so much over the years, began to complain. And yeah, as I'm sure you can imagine, it wasn't long before Jesse was broke and looking for another score. In the meantime, however, trouble was a-brewing. Just a few weeks after the Glendale robbery, gang member Tucker Basham went and got himself arrested. Apparently, he had gotten drunk in Nashville and started flashing around a large wad of cash. Not only would he confess to the robbery, but he also named Jesse and Ed Miller as his accomplices. He named the others as well, but thankfully he only knew them by their nicknames. And believe me when I say Jesse was not a happy camper. He was also growing increasingly paranoid. The point even his friends were suspect. And since he couldn't get to Basham, he instead turned his attention to Ed Miller. Now this is still somewhat contested, but Miller would go missing at some point during the summer of 1880. As to what really happened to him, that just depends on who you ask. Jesse's cousin Clarence would later state that Miller threw down on Jesse after they got into an argument over tobacco. Miller missed, but Jesse did not. Another story is that Ed and Jim Cummins were fighting over a girl. Somehow Jesse's name got pulled into the mix, and that's when he shot Miller dead. There are additional stories that Miller was possibly working with authorities, or that he simply wanted out of the gang. There are some that even insist that his death was a hoax, and that Miller just moved to Kentucky and lived out the rest of his days in peace. It's hard to say where the truth lies, but me personally, I'm leaning towards Jesse killing him. I think more than anything, he was worried about Ed yapping to the law the same way that Basham did. And since Ed knew where Jesse and Frank lived, the smart choice was just to eliminate the threat. Sounds a little strange considering how close Jesse was to Ed's brother Clell. But then again, remember what I said earlier about paranoia. Future gang member Charlie Ford would later describe how Jesse scrutinized everybody, including his own brother Frank. Hell, he even plotted to kill Jim Cummins, and him and Jim went way back, all the way to Quantrell's Raiders. If I'm not mistaken, Jim was one of the ones that took Jesse into Lexington after he got shot in the lung. These past ties notwithstanding, I guess Jesse felt like Jim was acting squirrely and asking too many questions. He tried to get Dick Liddil and some others to kill him, but Jim lamb-chopped it before they could make it happen. For what it's worth, though, Cummins had been a wanted man for quite a while, which somewhat explains his sudden disappearance. Far as I know, he never snitched on his compadres. Now, despite these setbacks, Jesse still needed to turn a profit. That being the case, in early September, he and the boys robbed a wagon full of tourists at Kentucky's Mammoth Cave. Skip ahead to October 15th, they struck again, holding up a general store over in the town of Mercer. The owner operated a nearby coal mine and kept money for his employees there at the store. Only problem was the payments were delayed, so the bandits were only able to make off with around $13 and a gold pocket watch. Their next job, however, proved much more lucrative. An army payroll in northern Alabama netted them over $5,000, or a little over $150,000 in today's money. But the good times never seem to last, do they? No sooner were they back in Nashville than Ryan made the same mistake as his old buddy Tucker. Got drunk, started brandishing his revolver and bragging about what a big bad outlaw he was. Typical Irishman, right? Ryan was arrested and extradited to Missouri. He'd later be found guilty, thanks in no small part to Basham's testimony, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. To the best of my knowledge, Ryan did his time like a man, and much like Jim Cummins, never rolled on Jesse. Nevertheless, the James brothers still played it safe and got the hell out of Dodge. Despite Frank not participating in those recent robberies, he did know Ryan. Didn't like him, but he did know him. And more importantly, just like Ed Miller, Ryan knew where he lived. Guess Frank didn't want to risk it, so he too fled Nashville, albeit reluctantly. Remember, up till that point, he had been enjoying the life of an honest man. Frank would later recall his time farming and working as a teamster as the happiest he had been since childhood. And it was, quote, with a sense of despair that I rode away from our little home and again became a wanderer. You gotta think, as much as Frank may have wanted to go straight, he was still the brother of Jesse James. And like it or not, their destinies were forever intertwined, especially considering what happened next. On July 15th, 1881, the gang, Frank included, boarded a train at the Winston Depot, just outside of Gallatin, Missouri. Jesse positioned himself in the smoking car, along with Frank and Wood Height, as Wood's brother Clarence and Dick Liddil made their way to the platform on the express car. And then, just as soon as everybody was in place, Jesse rose to his feet and started shooting, killing the conductor and an innocent passenger. They then stole what they could from the express car, wasn't much, just $600, and made their escape. Now, those killings were almost certainly accidental. Jesse had been shooting high, and I guess the two victims just happened to stand up at the worst possible time imaginable. Still, though, accident or not, these killings sent shockwaves throughout Missouri. Even in his hometown of Kearney, folks began speaking out against him. Hell, the newly elected governor, Thomas Crittenden, even pledged to make Jesse a special project of his. Sure enough, a week later, Crittenden met with representatives from all the major railroads there in Missouri. They all pitched in, and within days, the governor issued a whopping $10,000 bounty on each of the James brothers, along with an additional $5,000 per man for the rest of the gang. Meanwhile, Jesse just got busy planning his next heist, which, as fate would have it, would also be his final heist. It would also occur exactly 5 years to the day that he and the Youngers struck Northfield. On the evening of September 7th, 1881, he and the boys quietly assembled in a forest outside of Glendale, Missouri. And yes, this is the actual town of Glendale this time, a few miles outside of St. Louis. To be more specific, the area was known as Blue Cut, on account of steep outcroppings lining a curve in the tracks that forced trains to slow to a creep. In preparation, the bandits piled large rocks on the tracks and wrapped a lantern with a red cloth. The engineer would later state that the man flagging down the train had on a mask, and that he saw him set the lantern on a pile of stones between the rails. And thankfully this time, Jesse refrained from killing anyone. They did beat the shit out of the express messenger, though. Guess he was a little too slow in opening up the safe, so they pistol whipped him. And when the contents of the safe wasn't to Jesse's liking, he got pistol whipped again for good measure. When they were done, Jesse tipped the engineer and gave a bow to the passengers before bidding them a good evening. The entire ordeal was over in less than half an hour, and all they managed to steal was just around $1,000. By the way, joining the outlaws there at the Blue Cut was a newcomer by the name of Charlie Ford. Jesse had first met Charlie and his brother Bob during the summer of 1879. And per sources, Jesse and Charlie became fast friends. Matter of fact, Jesse would often visit the house that Charlie shared with his brothers and sister Martha. According to historian T.J. Stiles, quote, thanks to this emerging circle of friendships, the center of Jesse's social life shifted to the home of Ford's sister, a youthful widow named Martha Bolton, who lived in Ray County just east of Richmond. She was an attractive woman, and Dick Liddil in particular became fond of her. Bolton's home soon emerged as the regular rendezvous for the outlaws and their associates. Now, more on the Fords here in just a moment, but like I was saying, the Blue Cut robbery was the last that Jesse James would ever pull. And once more, quote TJ Styles, the next 7 months belonged to his enemies and to the making of enemies. And yeah, I really can't stress just how unpopular Jesse was becoming. Hell, even his old newspaper buddy, John Edwards, had ghosted him. What's more, a delegation of ex-Confederates issued a formal condemnation, saying that they'd be content with nothing less than the gang's extermination. By the way, this is also around the same time when Bill Ryan got convicted and sentenced to prison. In other words, Jesse's world was quickly coming unraveled. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by Mint Mobile. I don't know about you, but I like keeping my money where I can see it. Unfortunately, traditional big wireless carriers also seem to like keeping my money. After years of overpaying for wireless, I finally got fed up from all the crazy high wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks that actually cost more in the long run, and I made the switch to Mint Mobile. I actually just got an email from them last month wishing me a happy 1-year Mintversary. And in that year, based on my rough calculations, I've saved nearly $900. Simply put, Mint Mobile works. Say adios to those overpriced wireless plans. Switch to Mint Mobile and get premium wireless starting at just $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with your existing contacts. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/wildwest. That's mintmobile.com/wildwest. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra, see Mint Mobile for details. And now, let's get back to the show. Now, if you've ever seen the Assassination of Jesse James, this is basically the same time frame that the movie is set in. Not only do you get to see the Blue Cut train robbery in action, but you're also privy to Jesse's increasing levels of paranoia. That and the gang's gradual downfall. Remember, Ed Miller was dead, likely at the hands of Jesse himself. Bill Ryan and Tucker Basham were behind bars. Same goes for Cole Younger and his brothers. Frank James had already called it quits and returned back east, and on top of all of that, Wood Hite and Dick Liddil were beefing. Stories differ as to why, but some think that Wood had accused Liddil of stealing some of his loot. Others think the dispute arose on account of both of them being sweet on Charlie's sister Martha. And then, of course, there were the rumors of Liddil having an affair with Hite's mother-in-law. Whatever the case, following Ryan's conviction, Jesse sent word for everyone to meet him at his Uncle Hite's place over in Kentucky. And when Liddil arrived, he and Wood began almost immediately butting heads. Things got so tense that they decided to step outside and have a proper duel. Both men ended up missing their shots, and Dick just hopped in the saddle and rode away. A few weeks later, Wood got arrested for killing a black farmhand. He escaped, though, and made a beeline straight to Martha's place. Only problem was Dick Liddil was already there. So was Charlie Ford's little brother, Bob. Didn't take long for Hite and Liddil to start arguing yet again. Things finally came to a head, and they jerked iron right there in the house. And despite both men emptying their revolvers, none of their shots were fatal. Hite was wounded in the arm and Liddil in the right thigh. Wood was actually in the process of pulling another pistol when Bob Ford rushed in and put a bullet squarely in his head. Now, we haven't spoken much of Bob yet, but contrary to popular belief, he was not a member of Jesse's gang, at least not officially. That said, he had joined his brother and a few of the others in holding up a stagecoach the previous summer, so he weren't exactly no angel either. Now, this killing was a pretty big deal, considering that Wood Hite was Jesse's first cousin. And if there's one thing we know about Jesse James, it's that he absolutely loved his first cousins. Just ask his wife. Hell, Bob and Dick got so nervous they disposed of Hite's body in an unmarked grave. Just their attempt at getting rid of the evidence. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but after Jesse and Frank fled Nashville, they settled in Kansas City. Just not for very long. Frank left for Kentucky in late October, and a month after that is when Jesse moved his family to St. Joseph. And on Christmas Eve of 1881, they moved yet again, only this time just around the corner to 1318 Lafayette Street. Jesse liked the way the house sat on a hill, giving him a commanding view of his surroundings. According to Charlie Ford, quote, he could see anybody and nobody could see him. And he said that he would not be afraid of 100 men if he knew they were coming. Once again, I got to reference the movie The Assassination of Jesse James. Awesome movie, by the way. If you haven't seen it, check it out. There's a scene where Bob Ford helps Jesse move his belongings over to that new house, but in all reality, that was Charlie, not Bob. If I'm not mistaken, Charlie had been living with the James family ever since they moved to St. Joseph. And by this point, unbeknownst to Jesse, both Charlie and Bob were actively conspiring against him. And they had been pretty much ever since the governor issued that huge bounty. It wasn't all about the money, though. There's also the fact that Jesse had given a beating to their 15-year-old cousin, Sam. Turns out Sam's mother was the sister of Jim Cummins. Jesse paid him a visit one day, hoping to figure out where Jim was hiding, and it was while he was there that he roughed the kid up. Gotta imagine that Bob and Charlie didn't much appreciate it. And then, of course, you got Dick Liddil. Remember, he had been running scared ever since that shooting scrape with Wood Height. He'd later admit that he mistrusted Jesse and thought that he was planning to kill him. And to be fair, he probably was. I guess Dick figured he'd make a move before Jesse got the chance. The only thing is, Bob Ford beat him to it. You see, Bob met with the governor in secret on January 13th over in Kansas City. And he did agree to cooperate. Said that he and Charlie would do what they could to capture Jesse, just so long as they could get their hands on that reward money. Bob also requested clemency for Dick Liddil. The governor agreed, and Dick turned himself in a week later. Now, you got to keep in mind that Jesse was not yet aware of any of these betrayals. Even Liddil's arrest was kept under wraps. Matter of fact, he and Charlie would head to Kansas that March to scout out some likely prospects. And on the way back, they swung by Martha's place and picked up Bob. Hell, Jesse even gifted him with a fancy nickel-plated revolver and invited him to come stay at the new house over in St. Joseph. Just the opportunity that the Fords had been waiting on. Only issue was that Jesse was watching them like a hawk. The Fords knew damn well they couldn't beat Jesse face to face. Hell, Charlie would even admit as much. Quote, "I knew he was quicker than I, and I would not try it when he had his arms on. Arms meaning pistols. He was so watchful that no man could get the drop on him. We waited a long time to catch Jesse without his revolvers, knowing that unless he put them off, we could not fetch him." End of quote. And yeah, watchful or not, Jesse was still a mere mortal, and us mortals have been known to let our guards down on occasion. To paraphrase the great Larry McMurtry, life is but a knife edge, and sooner or later we all slip and get cut. And unfortunately for Jesse, that slip came on the morning of April 3rd, 1882. He and the Ford brothers had gone outside after breakfast to feed the horses. I guess they were planning on leaving for Platte City later on that evening in preparation for another bank job. And when they stepped back inside is when Jesse removed his coat and gun belt. Then, according to Charlie Ford, quote, "He went to brush off some pictures, and when he turned his back, I gave my brother the wink." Now, the picture in question was of his wife's niece, Nanny Mims, I think. I've seen other sources that say it was a painting of Jesse's favorite horse. Whatever the case, Jesse did grab a feather brush and started dusting, but in his haste, he accidentally bumped the frame. That's when he slid a chair over and climbed on top. As he started fumbling with the wire hanger trying to straighten the frame is when he heard it. Once again, per Charlie, quote, "We both pulled our pistols, but he, my brother, was the quickest and fired first. I had my finger on the trigger and was just gonna fire, but I saw his shot was a death shot and did not fire. He, Jesse, heard us cock our pistols and was about to turn his head. The ball struck him in the back of the head and he fell." End quote. As soon as Jesse's wife Z heard the shot, she came running, only for Charlie to claim that the pistol had gone off on accident. "Yes," Z said, "I guess it went off on purpose." The brothers then ran to the telegraph office and sent a messenger to the governor. After that, they surrendered to authorities. Now, Jesse's funeral was held in Kearney on April 6th, with over 1,000 mourners in attendance. He was then laid to rest at his mother's farm, same one the Pinkertons had tried to burn back in 75. The preacher who conducted the service quoted from the book of Matthew, "Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh." Meanwhile, John Newman Edwards penned the following as an obituary. "We called him outlaw, and he was, but fate made him so. When the war closed, Jesse James had no home. Proscribed, hunted, shot, driven away from among his people, a price put upon his head, what else could the man do with such a nature except what he did do? He refused to be banished from his birthright, and when he was hunted, he turned savagely about and hunted his hunters. Would to God he were alive today to make a righteous butchery of a few more of them." End of quote. Edwards also began raising money for Z and the children. Seems that despite Jesse's best of intentions, they were still broke. And what little they did have, at least what was provably stolen, got returned to the original owners. It was also Edwards who began negotiating on behalf of Frank James. Remember, Frank had long grown weary of being a night rider, and following his brother's death, he went ahead and took a chance. On October 5th, 1882, Frank stepped inside the governor's office at Jefferson City. He then unbuckled his gun belt and handed it over. "Governor, I am Frank James. I surrender my arms to you. They have not been out of my possession since 1864. No other man has ever had them since then. I now give them to you personally. I deliver myself to you and the law." Now, obviously, that's not entirely true, as the type of revolver that Frank handed over had not yet been invented in 1864, but I guess the sentiment remains. Frank was tried for the Winston train robbery, but he won an acquittal. He was also tried for his role in the Muscle Shoals robbery, the one down in Alabama, one of the few crimes he was actually innocent of, and once again, he won an acquittal. He was due to be tried again for an 1876 train robbery, but one of the key witnesses passed away. Imagine that. So the prosecution just dropped the case. All total, Frank James spent about a year in jail. And once that last case fell apart, the governor told him to locate a farm and get to work. Said to stay the hell out of trouble and avoid the limelight. And if he could manage that, then the governor promised not to let him be extradited to Minnesota. Frank was 39 years old when he turned himself in. And he'd go on to live another 3 decades. True to his word, he would keep to the straight and narrow. He'd go on to work a series of odd jobs, doing everything from picking fruit to selling shoes. Hell, he even operated his own Wild West show with Cole Younger before finally retiring to the old farm. It's there where he charged the curious a quarter apiece just to see the house where his famous brother was born. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, many journalists paid the price of admission over the years, although it did not always guarantee a visit with Frank. Still, several reporters did manage to get stories from the famous bandit. And during one interview, Frank was asked something that he had never been asked before. The reporter wanted to know if Frank thought what he had done with his life had been worthwhile. Frank paused for a moment, as if his mind was racing over the scenes of his past. Foolhardy charges, smoking revolvers, bloody corpses, and the faces of Quantrell, Bloody Bill, Cole, Jesse, his mother, and Joseph Haywood. Finally, Frank answered, "If you're not a quitter, anything you've done has got to be worthwhile. You can make it worthwhile. I guess if I had to do it all over, and had to make the choice as a young man, I'd rather have all the pain and danger and trouble than to just be a plain farmer. If I had an old man's head, I would choose different." End of quote. By the way, I do have a short standalone episode on Frank James regarding an incident that occurred years later when he was selling shoes down in Dallas. Evidently, he had to deal with a loudmouth bully who wasn't aware of his identity. It's not my most popular episode by a long shot, but it is one of my personal favorites. I will drop a link down below if you're interested in checking it out. Frank would die there at his mother's farm on February 18, 1915. He had been worried about grave robbers, so he asked to be cremated. Ironically, the ashes were then kept in a bank vault until his wife's passing in 1944. The remains were then buried together over in Independence. Jesse's widow Z would live another 18 years following Jesse's death, passing away in November of 1900. Legend has it that she pretty much lived in poverty those last few years. Her daughter Mary got hitched in 1901 and had a passel of kids. She died in Kansas City in 1935 after a prolonged stay in the hospital. Of what, I'm not entirely sure. Her brother Jesse Edwards James graduated from law school in 1907. Had him in office in Kansas City for a number of years before moving to California. Ended up writing a book about his father's life and even starring as his father in at least 2 movies, Jesse James the Outlaw and Jesse James Under the Black Flag. He died in Los Angeles in 1951 at the age of 75. Jesse's mother Zerelda made it all the way to 1911 after having outlived 3 husbands and 4 of her 8 children. Remember Bill Ryan, that Irishman who got sentenced to life? Well, that sentence was commuted, and he was released from prison in 1889. He'd always sworn that if he got out, he'd kill Tucker Basham, but I guess he either changed his mind or just never got around to it, as Basham lived all the way till 1922. I got no idea what became of Ryan, other than he supposedly traveled west to California. Woodhite's brother Clarence was arrested shortly after Dick Liddil's surrender. He too would be sentenced to prison, but died a year later from tuberculosis. Jim Cummins spent time in Colorado and California and actually tried to turn himself in on several occasions, but nobody believed he was who he said he was, or at least that's what he claimed. He'd write a book of his own in 1903 and spent the rest of his days in an old soldier's home there in Missouri. Matter of fact, he'd end up killing one of his fellow residents there with his bare hands. Charges were never filed, and Jim passed away in 1929 at the age of 83. Dick Liddil received a pardon and even testified against Frank before being deemed an unreliable witness. Later, he'd travel west with Bob Ford before returning east to work as a horse trainer. He would actually die of a heart attack while attending a race over in Kentucky on July 13, 1901. As for the Ford brothers, they'd be indicted for first-degree murder. They pleaded guilty and were sentenced to death, but the governor issued an unconditional pardon for the both of them. Bob would stand trial again for the murder of Woodhite, but won an acquittal. The brothers would go on to star in a stage production titled How I Killed Jesse James. But it turned out to be a short-lived venture. Charlie came down with tuberculosis, got himself addicted to morphine, and ended up taking his own life in 1884. That's when Bob and Dick Liddil headed west. They opened up a saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and Bob even moonlighted as a police officer. A paper out of Albuquerque would joke that if anyone in Vegas decided to break the law, they should refrain from doing so while hanging pictures. It's also there in Vegas where Bob was allegedly challenged to a shooting match by none other than Jose Chavez y Chavez. Yeah, this is the same Chavez who rode with Billy the Kid. I'm not sure how true the story is, but legend has it that Bob fled town after Chavez challenged him to a duel. He opened another saloon south of Santa Fe before migrating north to Creede, Colorado. And it was there on June 8, 1892, when a man named Ed O'Kelly stepped inside Bob's tent saloon with a double-barreled shotgun. He yelled out Bob's name and opened fire, instantly killing the man who killed Jesse James. Bob was exactly 6 months shy of his 31st birthday, and as far as I know, O'Kelly's motive has not yet been determined. Of course, O'Kelly himself would be shot dead by a police officer in Oklahoma just 11 years later. Now, before we go, several people have asked me whether or not Jesse was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. I don't know a ton about this group, but from what I understand, they were a secret society, sort of like the Masons, only very much pro-slavery. I even think their main goal was to create a new country where slavery was legal. Among the Circle's alleged members were John Wilkes Booth, Albert Pike, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and, of course, our very own Jesse James. Matter of fact, some even allege that Jesse was the treasurer. That said, I have found zero credible evidence linking Jesse to the Knights of the Golden Circle. And really, this is just getting into conspiracy territory. Secret symbols, buried treasure, that sort of shit. I'm not really sure how Jesse could have been the treasurer when he was constantly on the run. I'm also not sure why they'd want to bury their money out in the middle of nowhere if they were such a powerful organization. Why not just recruit a banker and keep the money locked away in a vault? I know you may have heard otherwise, especially on the so-called History Channel, but there just is not any proof that Jesse was involved. Speaking of conspiracies, one that still lingers to this day is the idea that Jesse's death was a hoax and that he lived to be an old man. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. So please join me here on Wednesday as we examine the evidence, or lack thereof. We'll also talk about the 1995 excavation DNA test. Now, real quick before we go, I do want to give a shout out to the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum out of Oklahoma City. They just launched a new podcast called This Week in the West, where they share stories of the people and events that shaped the West, and those still shaping it today. You can give it a listen at nationalcowboymuseum.org or wherever you listen to podcasts by searching for This Week in the West. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got on the death of Jesse James. Do me a favor and try not to shoot any train conductors, okay? Don't go beating up on any 15-year-olds, and please, if you absolutely have to straighten a picture, make damn sure nobody's standing behind you. All right, till next time, adios.